Wild one, we're pretty excited about the show that we have lined up. We're going to kick it off with this really fun video and then a moment of silence for... We're taking a remembrance and a show of respect for our friends after that. But first, we're kicking it off with this.
So welcome to Free Media. I'm Robbie Suave.
And I'm Amber Duke. Let's get right into it. HBO's Bill Maher has a message for liberals who dream about moving to Canada or Western Europe. Those places are not all they're cracked up to be. Let's watch.
Canada has the highest debt to GDP ratio of any G7 nation. I don't know what that means, but it sounds bad. So does their vaunted healthcare system, which ranks dead last among high-income countries in access to primary health care and ability to see a doctor in a day or two. And it's not for lack of spending. Of the 30 countries with universal coverage, Canada spends over 13% of its economy on it, which is a lot of money for free health care. Look, I'm not saying Canada still isn't a great country. It is, but those aren't paradise numbers.
Let's hear what Maher also had to say about immigration. Let's take a look.
Sweden opened its borders to over 1.5 million immigrants since 2010, and now 20% of its citizens are foreign-born, and its education system is tanking, and it has Europe's highest rate of gangland killings. And one result is that the far-right parties are in the government now there for the first time. To which liberals say blaming immigrants for the rising crime rate is racist. Yeah, but is it true? Of course it's true. It's not a coincidence the quality of life went down after the Somali gangs started a drug turf war using hand grenades.
So every now and then, Robbie, I think Bill Maher kind of stumbles across a kind of conservative take, and conservatives run to praise him and celebrate him as this sort of based ex-liberal, but I'm sure next Friday on his show he'll say something else that will anger them. But let's start with Canada, right? Mm-hmm. Because he talks about the healthcare system, single-payer healthcare, not as great as all of the left-wingers would have you believe. But the other thing he didn't get into there was Canada's crackdown on free speech. There was, of course, the desire of Trudeau and his government to prevent the freedom convoy of the truckers protesting vaccine mandates, to be able to engage in their protest, and then he ended up seizing the bank accounts of some of them and preventing their ability to either get donations or in general use their own money freely as they saw fit. So yeah, it's kind of a hellscape.
Yes, it's always interesting to see and hear some American liberals pine for Canada, our neighbor to the north, especially their health system being so good. Then you find out, well, what is the wait time to see a doctor there? In a lot of cases, it's astronomically longer to get critical care you need. You have people in Canada come to the U.S. So I think it's not all it's cracked up to be. And you're so right to point out the infringements on civil liberties and free speech that this supposedly progressive government has pursued. I actually think a lot of people's assumptions about Canada and even a lot of European states, how they're run, end up being wrong in both directions, because I've seen on some measures, Canada has a less intrusive they've been ranked on economic freedom indexes as more free sometimes than the U.S. because while they might spend more but proportionally on welfare and on healthcare and on things, but I think in some ways they tinker with the economy less, so there's less wholesale regulation of industry. I want to have that less regulation, and then also maybe the American approach to the welfare state, because it's clearly getting amok there. But here's where we're going to disagree, I bet.
Yes, I'm sure.
Is it immigrants who are responsible for rising problems in some of these countries, including in Europe, rising crime? So as far as I know from looking at the statistics in the U.S. context, maybe it could be different in Europe, I don't know. It doesn't seem to me that immigrants are especially likely or are more likely than the native population to commit crime. To the extent we have, rising, increasing crime in various cities, including in D.C., where we are right now, doesn't appear to be caused by a spike in immigration, to my mind. It's not to say there aren't problems, but I think there's something wrong about blaming it on immigrants.
Okay. Oh, let's start.
All right, let's go.
Okay,
Let's go.
let's start with Sweden, which he brought up in the statistics about the rise in gang criminality and the decline in the economy there. There's also been a huge rise in rape and sexual assault in Sweden that is directly attributed to the number of refugees that they've taken in since 2018 from mostly African Muslim countries. And Muslims from the Middle East as well. And so it's not a race issue, it's a cultural issue. And some of those cultures believe that it's justified to treat women in degrading and violent manners. So that's number one. But number two, to your point about whether those statistics bear out in the United States. It's kind of difficult for us to even say one way or the other because most U.S. states do not track crime that's committed by illegal aliens. The only state that does is Texas. And their prison data has been used by various think tanks, whether it's Cato or the Center for Immigration Studies, and they disagree wildly on what the data actually says. Basically, Cato says if you just look at the raw numbers, then it looks like illegal aliens commit less crime than Native Americans. And I'm talking about obviously people who are citizens of the United States, not like feather Native Americans. But the Center for Immigration Studies claims that they actually have higher rates of violent crime because they say that Cato fails to account for the fact that people are not automatically identified as legal aliens when they're first entered into the criminal justice system. Sometimes their immigration status isn't known until later. And so if you account for that, you end up having much higher crime rates among the illegal alien population. Now, you're correct to say that immigrants generally, if we're talking about legal immigrants in the U.S., they do tend to have either equal or lower crime rates than the Native American population, but we should expect that because our immigration system obviously has really strict processing. It takes years for people to get legal status, and we generally have a merit-based immigration system for the most part. So we should want that the legal immigrants we have coming here to have a better crime rate. But again, we don't really have good data on whether that's the case for illegal aliens. And so if you look at crime that's committed by illegal aliens, the question is, could we have prevented this by simply enforcing borders, for example?
Well, maybe. I mean, I think, look, I don't want violent criminals streaming across our borders, assaulting our women, etc. Obviously, that's very bad. I want to prevent gang-style criminal activity from taking hold in the U.S. The question is, and I think the answer is yes, could we prevent that, have whatever border security we need to prevent very dangerous people from coming to the country while still accepting, maybe by making the legal process easier for people to come here, people who have will subsequently go on to have low crime rates, who want to contribute to our economy, who want to start businesses, who want to work jobs, who want to grow our economy, who want to contribute meaningfully and productively to American society. And we have, the process to go through that is such a nightmare. And so we get more of the kind of reality of people going through, frankly, unsafe circumstances for them to come to the U.S. and then, massing on the border, creating some level of kind of just chaos and disorganization, I think, in border towns that is sometimes frustrating to the people who live there. I get that, but we've made the process so confusing and so difficult, and it seems like I think we should be able to have both. I think we should be able to make sure we're not importing violence into the country while still being welcoming and affirming of people who will make our country better off, because we need to build houses and we need to grow our labor force. We need to take advantage of the resource that human ingenuity is.
Yeah, and then you get into economic questions about immigration, which are probably a whole separate conversation that I'm sure we'll talk about on a future episode of this program. But I think just on the security aspect of it, we traditionally have not done a very good job, even through the legal immigration process, of preventing people coming from cultures that frankly don't respect rule of law or American tradition, which I think are important things when we're talking culturally about what we want our country to look like. We just saw last week, for example, a bunch of people in Dearborn, Michigan, legal immigrants, chanting "Death to America" in a protest. I mean, there's no reason why people like that should be able to come here and basically threaten the country who's done a favor to them by giving them a better opportunity.
I mean, but I got news for you, right? Like from a you're from a conservative standpoint, that the most hostile to like America and the founding values and all that, like that is a popular view among, right, like very left-wing people on college campuses.
Right, but I can't stop them from being born here.
No, right, who have been here, who came over on the
But I
Mayflower.
can stop a legal immigrant who feels the same way from coming.
My point being, my argument to conservatives who make this is that you can't, the threats to the way of life, to free markets and free speech and some values that we have in common, although we disagree on a lot else, is that like the threat is homegrown. It's not
Right.
it's not being polluted by people coming in. It's that there's fundamental disagreement. Even among people who've been here for generations and are wealthy and privileged that hold dissenting or different values. And I want a system where people can exercise, I guess, the least amount of control over someone else's life as possible, and you can decide how to run your own life and have decision rights over your property and your space, and someone else can do that for their property and their space. I think it's a little bit of misdirection to say everything would be fine if we could keep out these people who chant death to America. I'm like,
I think
we'd
that's a
still
straw
go to
man,
Berkeley
though.
and they'd be
We're not-
chanting it every day, even if their grandparents and great-grandparents were born here.
But that's a straw man, right? Because I'm not saying that everything would be solved if we just prevented those people from coming to the United States. That's part of obviously a larger strategy to try to raise good citizens and have people here who want to contribute productively to society and don't hate the country that they either grow up in or immigrated to.
But doesn't that-
and Sweden should be a warning of what happens when you don't exercise that right to control who comes across your borders, and you bring in a bunch of people, import a bunch of people who end up raping your women. I mean, that's like worst case scenario.
A lot of the people coming from Mexico, coming over our southern border, are fleeing socialist dystopias that they despise.
Then they can
are
apply for
terrified
asylum.
of inflation, have seen what inflation does. Some of them are religious conservatives. They come from nations that are more Catholic than ours. They don't like communism. Like, they have a lot. Like, frankly, I'm not afraid of their cultural values ruining our country. I welcome these cultural values as a warning they could send to the rest of the country about what having high inflationary policies, empowering socialism, how it can go wrong and lead to massive political repression.
Yeah, I mean, I think those people from different countries in Central and South America are not monolithic. So if you're talking about Cubans or Venezuelans, you might be on the right track. But at the same time, Venezuela now has homegrown or is importing gangs here now, where we have Tren de Aragua in New York City terrorizing American citizens and then sending the money back to Venezuela. So, I mean, it's not just like, oh, they're all Catholics and they all wear crosses around their necks, so they're all good people. I mean, there still has to be a modicum of screening for people's...
No, disagree. We can screen it, but the way the right talks about the immigrants coming in is it's entirely an invasion. They're entirely hostile to the American project.
It's millions
not,
of people a year, and that's on top of 2
who
million
wanna work and hate
gotaways.
socialism
We have
in
no
some
idea
cases.
who they are.
All right. Well, no problem to do some screening. You let us know what you think about it. More of Free Media after this.
So, my heart goes out to Dive Crew Canada. Those are a couple of big losses. I can't get choked up here. I'm an emotional guy, so I will. Sorry for your loss, brother. I hope that our moment of respect there will be remembered. Like, that you feel that. We care about you, man. We care about everybody here. Anyways, we've got a lot more fun videos. We're going to snap back into great fun stuff. Let's get back into it, guys. This is pretty crazy. You guys
Well, there are
watch
hundreds,
Rebel News?
perhaps thousands
Watch
of
these
delegates
guys and
inside
subscribe.
the Shaw Conference Center. I have to say, it felt culturally repelling to me. I'm more used to grassroots people, hardworking, blue-collar folks, or business people, or professionals, people who work for a living and pay taxes. In there, I felt like it was an ocean of bureaucrats and lobbyists and hucksters, really, everyone with a little scheme. It felt like the World Economic Forum meeting in Davos, but that you actually see VVIPs. You bump into Tony Blair or John Kerry or the CEO of Pfizer on the street. Here, it's all the grasping lower-level bureaucrats, but they still get a pretty good gig out of it. I mean, five-star hotels, going to conferences around the world. It just felt like every single one of them was sitting on the shoulders of the industrial wealth-creating class. I don't know. Going in there, you could see a real difference between the makers and the takers. But not everyone who's at the conference is a believer that plastics are evil and government is the solution. I'm joined by Dr. Chris Darmett, who is an expert in plastics that doesn't believe in the ideology inside. Tell me who you are and what you stand for.
So I'm the author of The Plastics Paradox. I've got a PhD in polymer science, and I'm a crusader for truth. Let's not fight for political agendas or some end game. Let's first look at the evidence. I'm a scientist, right? So you have to look at the evidence and then make up your mind based on what the science says. So I read 4,000 peer-reviewed studies, unpaid, completely unfunded. I'm here on my own dime because I actually care about the truth and making decisions that make sense based on the truth. And I agree with what you just said. These people are just here for making money, making themselves feel important, and fighting for an agenda which ironically has the exact opposite effect of the intentions that they state up front. So that's a problem. They're saying that they're for the environment, and the things that they're suggesting are anti-environment and are scientifically proven to increase waste, increase litter, increase greenhouse gas, increase fossil fuel, and that is a scientific fact. So they're charlatans.
You know, some people in there are the kind of folks I encounter in Canada a lot, wealthy, rent seekers would be the technical term, people trying to get a grant or something. Right. But I sort of recognize them culturally. They're from Canada. They have a university degree. They're probably making six figures. I understand their patter. But what is hard for me to fathom are the hundreds of delegates from extremely poor countries that have real environmental problems that have nothing to do with, you know, plastic forks in Canada or a plastics registry. And I can't imagine people here from Somalia or Nigeria that this is a genuine, like, I bet those countries have very serious pollution problems, but none of it's got to do with plastics.
Right, so you make a great point. If you look at the correlation between what's green and how much something costs, you find out the more expensive something is, the less green it is. So if you want to generate a kilogram of gold, that means generating 27,000 kilograms of CO2. Right, so it's the worst for the environment and the most expensive. You never throw it away, you always recycle it because it's most expensive and because it causes the most harm. On the other end of that scale, you have like polyethylene, which is so cheap and so green that it's barely worth recycling. It's harder to make money recycling it. So that's exactly coming back to your point. We as rich people are telling these poor people to spend more in order to increase harm, right? We're telling them spend more money on metal, spend more money on glass, spend more money on things which are scientifically proven to increase harm and cost them more money, and it's money they don't have. We're sitting in our fancy suits, in our Escalades, and telling them what to do, and they don't have anything. It's a bunch of virtue signaling nonsense.
One of the weird things to me is the idea that plastics are toxic. It doesn't ring true. Everything we put in our mouth, in our body, next to our body, in our pocket, in our home, is plastic. It's the ubiquitous material, replacing in many cases wood and metal and the Federal Court of Canada recently struck down the government's view that plastics are toxic by definition. It was found not to be scientifically true.
The FDA actually has a plastics exemption. Everything plastic is assumed to be non-toxic because those molecules are so big they can't move, they can't get in your cells, they can't do anything. They're considered to be inert precisely because they are plastics. So it's the exact opposite of what they said. And I looked into the toxicity of plastics. They've been measured for 50 years. They're FDA approved to put in your mouth, as you just said, and they are non-toxic. They're less toxic than table salt, which we have on our tables. You could eat tablespoon after tablespoon, according to scientific studies, and nothing happens to you. You could eat tablespoons every day for a month and nothing happens to you. These things are as safe as sugar, they're as safe as eating an apple, and they're safer than nicotine or table salt or many of the things which we consider to be safe. So there are actual scientific definitions where you can look up what is toxic, what is non-toxic. Polyethylene, polypropylene, PET, polystyrene, PVC, they're all non-toxic, and that's not just the plastics, that includes the additives that go into them. They're also completely non-toxic.
You know, whenever we move away from plastics, like I hate the ban on plastic bags at the grocery store because, of course, I'm not schlepping around my big, heavy burlap bag with me. I never remember it. But there's just no way that reusing a bag is going to be more hygienic than getting a bag from the grocery. And by the way, you bring that bag home, now you can use it for something else, including if you have a dog, to walk up, clean up after the dog. Like, there's so many things. And I just think that that's such a step backwards. These paper straws instead of the plastic straws, the wooden forks instead of the plastic forks. And I just think surely everyone can see that this is a step backwards. And I keep on thinking, why? Why are they doing this? It can't be healthier. It's not cheaper. What are they doing to us?
When are they going to wake up? Your point is backed up by science. So the only way to know what's more green and less green is a life cycle analysis. That's the only scientifically proven way that's been validated for 50 years. And if you type in LCA for life cycle analysis bag into Google, anyone could do it at home right now. It takes you 10 seconds to find life cycle analyses on bags. There are 30 of them in the world, and everyone ever done says that the plastic bag causes less harm than paper bags, less harm than cotton bags, less harm than bioplastic bags as well. So given that the science has been done over decades, it takes you 5 seconds to find it. Why hasn't Greenpeace managed to type in LCA-BAG into Google in the last 20 years? Why hasn't the World Wildlife Fund? People are banning the bags. Afterwards, they go and look at the consequences. They found vastly increased sales of plastic, and they call, in their words, exponentially more greenhouse gas. And this is exactly what you would predict by looking at the studies ahead of time. Instead, they make ideology-based policies which are counter-scientific, and then they have to go back and look like idiots because they have to reverse their own policies after they generated more harm.
So what are we going to swing into now? A little bit more Rebel news. I will tell you this much. I subscribe to their channel. They've got a great amount of content. It's awesome. You should check it out. They're a pay site, so I'm not trying to hack their stuff, but I do want them to know that we're showing their stuff. We give them credit. It's all down there. Their stuff is fun. Like, they're investigating like old school journalism. They're great. Next piece.
Ezra Levant for Rebel News, and I'd like to thank the UN for accrediting a citizen journalist outlet like us. Mr. Guilbeault, according to the Globe and Mail, you serve on the China Council for International Cooperation on Environment and Development, which is a government agency controlled by the Chinese Communist Party. Is that a conflict of interest with your role as a Canadian cabinet minister? And is it perhaps why you have really been gentle on China, even though it is by far the world's largest polluter, including with plastics pollution? Thanks again for letting me ask that question.
The Canada-China Council is an organization that has been in existence since, from memory, 1971 or 1972, and a succession of environment ministers from all colors and stripes, including under Stephen Harper. A number of environment ministers sat on this organization. It is a partnership where we exchange information on environmental issues, and we work together to develop public policies that are implemented in China to tackle a number of the things that we're talking about here.
You lost a court case to me, and the judge ordered you to pay $20,000, but instead of paying it yourself, you had taxpayers pay for it. Why? Minister Guilbeault, the court ordered you to pay me $20,000, but you foisted that on taxpayers instead. You illegally blocked me on Twitter. You fought for 2 years. You used $250,000 in taxpayers' money, and then you stiffed the taxpayer and foisted the bill on them. Why did you do that? Why don't you think you have to answer for $20,000 of legal bills that you send to the taxpayer to pay your fine?
Look at how cross Guilbeault is. Look. It's wild. This is fun. Rebel
Why
News
aren't you
is
talking
fun.
about it? You had a lot to say in court.
Yeah.
You claimed that your Twitter account was a personal account. If that's the case, why didn't you pay the fine personally? Do you disrespect taxpayers, Mr. Guilbeault? Sure seems that way. Hey, you're on the board of a Chinese agency, a Chinese government agency for the environment. How is that not a conflict of interest, given that you're in the Canadian cabinet? Is that why you never criticized China, the world's largest producer of plastic? Jesus. Why are your staff pulling at me? Why are they assaulting me, sir? Why don't you ever criticize China? Have you received help from China in your political campaigns too? China refuses to sign the anti-plastics treaty. Why are you forcing that on Canadians?
What does that mean, the registry, Mr. Guilbeault? What do you mean by it? What is the cost that the organization and taxpayer will need to pay for your registry?
Run away! Run away!
Rebel News, guys. I'm not going to be able to say enough or promote their channel enough. They do independent news like CBC and CTV Global. They get bought off to tell the story that our current government wants to tell. Fine. But these guys at Rebel News just, I cannot promote them enough. Like, I know that I'm trying to make my own thing here, but these guys are professionals. I'm just a hobbyist. These guys are fun to watch, and they're telling an important story. What's next?
Stephen Guilbeault, on the streets of Ottawa. I was running with my heavy backpack. Had a few questions for him. He didn't want to answer. We'll have more later.
Oh, hello. Do you have a warrant to be here?
Maybe there's a little bit of
I'm trying to have a fun channel.
right along here. Some happy little
Have
things.
some fun.
I love you, you love me. We all own our own bodies, so marry who you want and do whatever drugs you choose. And when it's time, you can die with dignity by determining your own end-of-life plan.
Hi, Maria!
Hi, Officer Winkles!
How you doing today?
I don't have to answer that question.
That is correct!
I'm recording you!
Am I being detained?
Nope!
Which I can legally do because I'm in a public place!
Come back if you have a warrant!
Alrighty!
Know your rights!
Yay!
Okay, Gumshoes, Carmen Sandiego is in a country where socialism failed. That narrows it down to Venezuela, Cuba, the former Soviet Union, Moldova, Laos, Vietnam, Albania, Angola. So we did some digging into your past.
Oh, the suspense is killing me!
But we still haven't solved the case, Holmes. Why is marijuana a Schedule 1 drug?
Elementary, my dear Watson. Nixon and racism.
What?
You okay? I don't know. Hey man, it's alright. It's alright. We've got qualified immunity. Qualified immunity. It's not for you, it's just for me. I shot your dog.
I shot your wife.
I get to go on with my life.
My favorite part is where the character says, I do not want green eggs and ham. And then Sam I Am says, that's fine. You don't have to eat them. That's your right. The end. It's a short book.
Here we see one of the last taxicab monopolies struggling for life. Competitors have entered their ecosystem.
Do you know what eminent domain abuse is? It's when the government decides the neighborhood of make-believe is better used by a Taiwanese LCD manufacturer.
Today we have a real senator. Hello, Senator.
How are you doing?
What is your favorite color?
I would have to say blue.
Me too. Tell me, why did you sell all your stock right before the crash?
I mean, it's literally just the tragedy of the commons, but they made it cute.
And that sound means we're in international waters. I'm gonna marry a robot and sell my kidney on eBay.
This is a funny
My
piece.
dearest Rowena, today the district attorney filed criminal charges against a two-door sedan.
Carmen Sandiego is hiding in a country that contains an American military base. Is she in Australia, Bahrain, Belgium, Brazil, Bulgaria, the British Indian Ocean Territory, Cuba, Germany, Djibouti?
Menace.
Circle, square, rectangle, war factory.
All right, Jack, where is your gay wedding cake?
I refuse to bake a gay wedding cake, and you can't force me to. It's my right.
That is your right, but it is my right to kick you off of this show. Please leave.
Yep.
You homophobic bearded meat goblin.
I just want enough to warm it up some. I don't want to set it on fire. It's very easy to set it on fire.
Well, today on This Old House, we're at the city zoning office because they think our new porch is 2 inches too close to the sidewalk, which is f***ing bullshit because their sidewalk is too far away from the street, which they'd know about if they'd read any of the emails I'd sent them over the past 18 months. So join us as we waste our whole f***ing day on this shit.
The premiere of Thomas the High-Speed Rail has been delayed again. And at the 10 Bitcoin level, you receive a handsome tote bag.
Quack! Good one! Quiet! Very good! Queen! What else starts with the letter Q?
Space lasers.
Oh!
John Podesta and Hillary Clinton had an email exchange about hot dogs.
Where do we get these puppets?
It's a beautiful day in the neighborhood, and you have a right to defend your house with firearms. With firearms.
All right, guys, that's a piece from our friends at Reason TV. Also, check out their channel. They do all of that content and give it out. You're allowed to use it. Like, it's weird what they're doing there, but they're really funny. And you can see why people would watch that. And we're going to jump into the next video. We've got so many of these guys. It's a fun afternoon. We planned this last night. We're having fun today. So enjoy the show.
Look, I'm an ANCAP. So if you ask me
I'm
what
a
the
libertarian,
ideal immigration
now,
policy
Dave
would
Smith is
be,
gonna
it would be
explain
that we wouldn't have an immigration
some of both
policy.
that.
And, you know, that's my ideal foreign policy is that we wouldn't have foreign policy. And my ideal economic policy is that we wouldn't have economic policy. I think that if we lived in an anarcho-capitalist society and every plot of land was either unowned or privately owned, then essentially immigration doesn't exist and people can move to where they are invited, and or they can homestead unowned land or something like that. So that would be my ideal. I think the more relevant question for libertarians is under this current very not libertarian order, where all of us are trying to move to a free society, or at least a freer society than we have, how should we think about immigration while there is this gigantic state, the biggest state in the history of the world, that we're living under? And my position on that has been that I believe libertarians should reject open borders. That is not something that is deduced from libertarian principles. I think basically what it comes down to is a question of government property. Now, obviously, in the border, particularly in Texas, there are parts of the border that are privately owned, where the landowner, the property owners, are explicitly asking the government to serve their one legitimate function, which is the protection of property. And so in that case, I think it's very easy for a libertarian to say that, yes, they have every right to stop people from trespassing on their property. And if government is to exist at all, that is their only legitimate function. And so I think it's very easy for a libertarian to say, yes, the government should assist them in protecting their property. But more largely with the question of how to handle government property, I think many libertarians treat it almost as a given that there kind of ought to not be restrictions on government property. Now, I know that's not exactly Chris's position, but I think that when arguing against libertarians who don't support open borders, many open borders proponents still almost act as if that is the libertarian given, which I just think it is not. Government property is created and maintained by taxpayers. They are forced at the threat of violence to give over their money in order to maintain this government property. And I don't think that it follows from that it's unowned or that it is owned by everyone equally. And I essentially would say that if you were to believe that, then you would get taken in some very strange directions. So libertarians believe, say, for example, that people have a right to do heroin. You own your body, you can put in it whatever you want to. It doesn't necessarily follow from that I believe you ought to be allowed to do heroin right outside of a public school, or maybe even enter the public school and do it in the girls' bathroom if you feel like doing it there. The government and government property is less than ideal by the nature that it exists. But as long as it does exist, I think libertarians can support reasonable restrictions. And I think that the influx of 7 million undocumented illegal aliens during Joe Biden's administration is way beyond the level of reasonable. I would point out that it's very hard to get good polling on open borders because it's so unpopular that no one even asks it in any of the surveys. I saw one recent poll that said it was something like 7% of people believe there should be less immigration restrictions. Whatever the percentage of that actually believes in zero restrictions, I'd imagine is a small percentage of that. The point is basically that overwhelmingly, the people in this country who have been forced at the threat of violence to fund this government do not want open borders. And the government is intentionally allowing millions of people to flood into this country. And I do not believe that the libertarian position is to cheer on the government doing something to the people with their money that they do not want done. So that would be, I guess, how I'd open this.
Okay, Chris?
Yeah, thanks. And thanks to you all for bringing this together. Thanks, Dave, for debating. As bad as a communist? Was that as bad as a communist? Maybe I can convince you otherwise. I don't know. But yeah, I mean, I think that on many of these points, we actually agree. I think as probably will come out during this discussion, really the crux of the disagreement is what counts as reasonable restrictions. But before I get to that, I'll just sort of lay out a little bit about why I'm an open borders person. And here again, I suspect that Dave isn't going to disagree with what I'm saying up to a point at least. But so I think there is this presumption from a libertarian point of view in favor of open borders. So the idea is something like this, you own your property, you have freedom of association. And so just as someone who's living in West Virginia, am free to invite someone from, say, Pennsylvania to come into West Virginia to say, attend a Super Bowl party at my house. It seems like I have the right to do that. Why? I have the freedom of association. I have private property rights. And so if I'm hosting someone in my house, it seems like we shouldn't have a problem with that from a libertarian perspective. Similarly, if I own a business in West Virginia and I want to hire someone who currently lives in Pennsylvania, they can cross the state border. They can come work for me. If I have housing that I want to sell in West Virginia to someone who currently lives in Pennsylvania, they can move to West Virginia and they can buy that housing. So seems all perfectly acceptable from a libertarian perspective. And so in terms of what an open borders policy would look like, I think it's probably not too far off from what the current sort of open border policy between individual United States is. So like I said, if you live in one state, you're free to move to different states. Now, there are some restrictions on free movement that I think everybody's going to accept. So if somebody, committed a murder in Pennsylvania and gets stopped in West Virginia, then I think everybody's going to say, well, okay, it's perfectly legitimate to restrict their freedom of movement, put them in prison and so on. But aside from those sorts of cases, you're more or less permitted to move freely across state borders. And so the open borders position is basically take that model and then apply it to national borders. So if somebody from Canada wants to buy housing for me or work for me, they should be allowed to do that. And as far as the justification for that goes, like I said, it seems like your rights of private property entitle you to do that. Your rights of freedom of association entitle you to do that. And also just, reflecting on the situations in my own life when I've moved, you might move for a different job, or you might move to be close to friends and family. You might move because you like the political structures in one state rather than another. These are all equally good reasons to move across national borders. And so again, the sort of basic picture of open borders is take the current model that we have for movement between states and then apply it to national borders. And I suspect we'll get into this more sort of in the back and forth. But I mean, I agree with Dave that the idea that there should be no restrictions whatsoever on the use of public property is not a good position. So there have to be some restrictions. And so really the debate is what sort of restrictions are going to be justified and which ones aren't. And my main objection to arguments against open borders that rely on this appeal to public property is that in many cases they would have sort of unlibertarian implications. So here again, I think, both Dave and I agree, no restrictions is probably not the correct position. Saying that the state can do whatever it wants in terms of restrictions is also probably not the right position. And so then the question is, okay, what sorts of restrictions are justified? And I think, we don't need a full-blown libertarian theory of public property to differentiate between good and bad reasons for restricting someone's access to the use of public property. So for example, you say, okay, we got public roads. What's a good reason to restrict someone's access to a public road? You might say, well, if they're dangerous. So if they've been drinking, if they're speeding excessively, you say, okay, you might say no longer should they have the right to access the public road because they're a danger to other people. But we can also come up with bad reasons to restrict someone's access to public property. So you might say, like, I don't know, like if the government says if you are caught listening to, I don't know, punk music. I don't like punk music. But like if you're caught listening to punk music in your car, we're going to deny you access to a public road. It's like, well, that's a bad reason. I don't think we would accept that as a good reason. And so then the question really becomes, are the sorts of reasons that non-open borders libertarians give in favor of restricting people's access to public property good ones? And I'm inclined to think not. And so I'll give one case and then I think we could probably move on. But so like one argument is that we need to restrict access to things like public roads because if we have high levels of immigration, this will lead to an increased tax burden for citizens or something like that. And there's an empirical question about whether or not that claim is true. But more generally, it just seems like we can't deny people access to a public road on the grounds that they might use that road to do something that will increase a taxpayer's burden. So, for example, I think most libertarians would say you should be allowed to ride a motorcycle without a helmet on a public road. But that increases the odds that you're going to get into like an accident that requires the use of like publicly funded health facilities to fix. And so if the principle or the reason is something like we can restrict someone's access to a public road when we think their use of the public road will increase taxpayers' burdens, that's going to have very non-libertarian implications in a lot of cases that have nothing to do with immigration. So I'll leave it at that, but I'm happy to go into more depth later.
Okay, Dave, you have up to 10 minutes to respond to any of that.
Okay, so I agree with a lot of what Chris said. I do think that this is one of the things that I've been critical of libertarians about on this issue. I think that sometimes we're living too much in theory and not marrying that theory with the real world. So when Chris says the example of like, or whatever your example is, but hey, if I have a cousin who lives in Italy and I invite my cousin over to my house and say, hey, I want you to come over here, and a government agent gets in the way of that, well, yeah, clearly that's not libertarian. Like, I invited him over and this is my property. Who has a right to tell me that I can't invite who I want to onto my property? But however, here in the real world, what's happening is that uninvited people are flooding in by the millions. They were not invited by anybody. We have caravans in the tens of thousands coming regularly of people who nobody invited. And in fact, every state government is arguing over who can ship them over to the other state and dump them on them, and nobody wants them. And to me, this kind of gets at the court, like, this is the other side of the argument, is that yes, it is true that from the libertarian position, if you are invited, you should have a right to go onto that person's property. But it's also true from the libertarian position that you have absolutely no right to enter property that you don't own uninvited. That is what we would call trespassing, which is what's going on in a very, so you have a libertarian error on both sides of this equation. And then the question becomes, well, how exactly, with the existence of a government, do we best work this out? And Hans Hermann Hoppe, who is very demonized, I think, by libertarians who support open borders, despite the fact that I really think the guy's worth reading and not just isolating like his most, most controversial passages. But his proposal was that libertarians should support a sponsorship system where invited people can come so long as someone invites them and vouches for them that they won't be a burden on the taxpayer and they'll be responsible for them, and uninvited people can't come. Now, that would require securing the border. But I think that, to me, that's probably the best way to simulate a libertarian situation in a statist paradigm. So I would say that that's the main thing that people should focus on, is that the real world problem is uninvited people coming, not invited people coming. And I'll probably grant Chris and agree with him that the amount of red tape and regulation for legal immigration is insane. And that's part of the reason it incentivizes people to not wait in line, because it's so difficult to actually go through the process. But the major crises, the reason why this is the number 2, or in some polls, the number 1 issue for voters in 2024, is because we have massive waves of uninvited illegal immigrants coming into this country. And then, of course, they're also just being put right on the dole as soon as they get here. In terms of the comparison between moving back and forth between states and moving back and forth between, say, South America or the rest of the world in here, I mean, look, the glaring difference is that we don't have a massive problem of uninvited people moving back and forth between states. You don't see just like 100,000 people marching from Georgia into South Carolina. And if you did, we'd start having a real problem, and Georgia would start thinking about and just expecting government services when they got there. And if that were the case, yeah, there'd be a real political issue in South Carolina of how to deal with this. So I will say that I'm glad we can kind of concede that zero restrictions doesn't work, and that there are restrictions that could be bad. So I think that in itself kind of destroys Chris's point by saying that there could be bad implications of restrictions, because we've already acknowledged that, yes, there could be bad implications of restrictions. There also could be bad implications of a lack of restrictions. If you're asking where exactly we say the reasonable restrictions land, well, I would say that if you have the overwhelming majority, and you cannot find an issue that Americans are more united on than opposing open borders. Good luck finding opposing pedophiles, maybe. I don't know what would top the 90+% of Americans who are all against open borders. But if you have a situation where you know that that the overwhelming majority, 90+% of property owners are not inviting these people, are explicitly saying, we do not want these people to come here. We have too many problems. We cannot deal with this also. And we as libertarians know that. And then I would also argue, we can get into this later, that the government is intentionally allowing this to happen against the will of all the property owners. I think that more than meets the threshold of reasonable to be on the side of restrictions in that case.
Okay, and we're going to let Chris do an uninterrupted response, and then Liz and I are going to jump into this conversation and have a little bit more of an unstructured conversation between all of us. So, Chris, go ahead and reply to anything of note that you think Dave has brought up in his rebuttal or introduction.
Yeah, sure. So I mean, I think you're sort of alluding to this point towards the end of your comments there. But here again, we might be that if we had a system where it was much easier to move to the United States legally, then something like a sponsorship or some sort of invitation program would probably function a lot better. And I mean, but the thing is, like, that might get us pretty close to functionally open borders. So, for example, if it were very easy for employers to, post advertisements for jobs that immigrants could apply for, and then if they got the job, they could be sponsored by their employers. I mean, I think that would result in considerably more immigration than we actually have. Would it get us to open borders? Maybe not, but I think it would get us a lot closer than the status quo. And also there are other sorts of what economists sometimes call keyhole solutions to some of these problems. So if the worry is immigrants, taxing public infrastructure and so on, and so, being net tax consumers or something like that. Well, one option might be something like an entrance fee for prospective immigrants. So, you move here, but whatever it is that we think is going to be consumed in taxes, they have to pay up front, or maybe the government can garnish their salaries, something like that. I still think pure open borders is better than that, but I also think that sort of middle ground position is much better than the status quo. So here again, if we're worried about the fiscal burden created by immigrants, which again, like I said, I'm not convinced that the empirical evidence bears that out. But if it is the case, you could just say, okay, maybe you have to pay a special entrance fee. And in terms of the invitation, I mean, here again, I don't know. I think that maybe people in Texas don't like when people from California move there. I don't know. But I could imagine people in Texas being like, look, all these Californians are moving to Texas and we didn't invite them. Well, okay, but I still think it's permissible for them to use roads in Texas and to buy housing from Texas property owners and to work for Texas employers, even if they're not explicitly invited. I think they still would have the right to use those roads.
Just outside Houston.
And then on the point about it being very unpopular,
it's a nice place.
It is unpopular. But most of what libertarians say is unpopular. So if we're gonna let people decide what is and is not permissible, that's not so good for libertarians in general. Forget immigration. We got you said we want to have heroin on the shelves of 7-Eleven. That's not very popular either. And so I'm just very wary of appealing to popular opinion in the case of a policy like this. Because I think that might lead to a lot of unlibertarian conclusions. So just to take another case, if it turned out that 90% of Americans, which this strikes me as plausible, are against legalizing certain sorts of drugs, I'm not convinced that would still be a moral justification for restricting the transportation of those drugs on a public road. Or if 90% of my neighbors don't want me to sell my house to someone because they said, well, we didn't invite this person. We don't want this person living here. I would say, well, yeah, I mean, you might not like it, but nevertheless, my property right entitles me to sell my house to this person, whether or not you approve of it. And so I think the same principle holds in the case of immigration. So if I want to sell my house to someone who's coming from another country, if 90% of my neighbors don't like it, I say, too bad. In the same way that if 90% of my neighbors say, I don't want you to marry that person, or I don't want that, to associate with that person in your house in our neighborhood, I'd say, too bad. It's not up for majority vote.
Hey, thanks for watching that clip from our show, Just Asking Questions. You can watch another clip here or the full episode here.
I don't think the options he's giving you right there are going to work, but those guys make these videos all the time. They just put them out and they're free to watch. Again, I'm promoting their stuff. I like Dave Smith. He's great. Check out his channel, Reason TV. They're also really solid. Check them out. We're gonna what do we have next? Pretty sure it's gonna be fun. Oh, we've got this.
What do you think of Mr. Trudeau?
Sorry, you guys have all seen
so
this
I think
before,
he's an egomaniac.
Everybody loves this piece.
And I think everything he does comes back to his egomania.
even his political ideology, if you really think about this expansionistic role of the state, it never comes back to serving an individual objective other than to make him more powerful or his legacy more grand. So let me give you a few examples. So he slashed the amount you can put into a tax-free savings account. But then he simultaneously increased the amount you were forced to pay into the state savings plan. He killed multiple pipelines. Then he invested state money in a pipeline. He attacked parents' ability to take care of their own children by removing tax fairness for families with a stay-at-home parent. And then he brings in a government program to replace it. So what you're seeing there is, you say, well, this sounds like these are utterly inconsistent positions. And the answer, no, they're not. They're all very consistent. In all cases, what he does is takes away the ability of business or individuals or families to do things for themselves, and it requires they do things through him and through the state. And his ideology is always about creating a pretext in order to justify the state garnering more control over every aspect of your life, how you raise your kids, how your business functions, what you see and say on the internet. He believes the state has to be everywhere always, but that's because, as King Louis would say, l'État c'est moi. The state is him.
Well, that's okay. So I got a couple of things to throw at that. The first is, I think it's a very dangerous thing to attack the man rather than the ideas. But you're making, as a rule of thumb, but you're making a case that in this case, that can't be done because there is a personality trait that is uniting diverse policy decisions that isn't ideational or ideological even. It is in fact personal. And so my sense of Trudeau, initially, I was very upset with his decision to run for prime minister because I thought, well, you don't know anything. And you're attractive and you can behave well in public and you have a charming facade, but you don't know anything in any real sense. And there's no indication that you do. You're not particularly well educated and you're not particularly accomplished. And this is actually a hard job. But worse than that, the only reason you even have the vaguest possibility of succeeding is because you have the same last name as your father. And then he ran. And I thought, well, how do you justify that to yourself? Because the gap of knowledge must have been painfully evident to him. And the fact that the Trudeau name, you could say, well, the Liberal Party came to me. That's his justification. They came to me and there wasn't another person that could win on the Liberal side and better a Trudeau Liberal, even if it's a consequence of family name, than any damn Conservative, let's say. But I still saw it as a manifestation of a really profound narcissism. I think a reasonable person would have said, I'm not prepared for this, certainly not yet. And I'm not the man that there needs to be in this position. And so I don't know what you think about those musings, but that's how I looked at Trudeau. And I certainly haven't seen anything in the preceding years that has disabused me of any of those notions.
I think there's some truth in that. His victory was definitely not a meritocratic one. And he was probably the least vetted prime ministerial candidate in our history. The media just glossed over so much of his life to go straight to help him and protect him. It was almost like they built a protective cocoon around him. And like he had dressed up in grotesque racist costumes so many times. He says by his own claim, he can't remember them all. I mean, the average politician had done that once. It would have been exposed and that person would have been expelled from politics altogether. He had run as a middle-class champion, even that while he sheltered the millions he inherited from his grandfather in a tax-preferred trust fund. All these things would have been front and center in the public sphere had it been anyone other than a Trudeau. But he was protected by the media, who still protect him because he really is their candidate. He represents the political class and the establishment in Canada, those who profit off a big bloated bureaucracy and regulatory state in the.
So, gang, we're going to change it up. We're going into something else, the next piece. Again, you've all seen that. It's super interesting. If you haven't, just like Poliev Peterson, it's easy to find, but we have more interesting things to show, and we want to show them.
The people of the world who have had experience, the Eastern
Similar,
Europeans
but
who had to
different.
live under the dark umbrella of communism, those who have escaped tyrannical regimes, that lady you had on from South Korea, when they come over here now and they see what we're doing with our freedoms, which is essentially turning them upside down and mocking them, and under the name of political correctness or wokeism, insisting, pushing, propagandizing, evangelizing these toxically stupid ideas and perverting the education system in their Putin and the warriors of the world, as Edward Luttwak calls them, they're laughing their heads off because they know this is a form of almost collective dementia.
Hello, everyone. I'm here today with Mr. Rex Murphy, which is always a pleasure. Rex is a Canadian commentator and author, primarily on Canadian political and social matters. He was the regular host of CBC Radio 1's Cross Country Checkup, a nationwide call-in show, for 21 years before stepping down in September of 2015. He is perhaps Canada's best recognized and most admired, and indeed most loved, journalist. Pleasure to see you, Rex. I'm glad we have a chance to talk again.
I think we should go over that bio part where you mentioned most loved. I think there are 3 dogs and 2 cats.
Yeah, well, it's hard to believe if you're loved, but it's definitely the case. So I wanted to talk to you today about the Trudeau government and just exactly what's going on. I thought I might give you a bit of background about exactly why I thought we should talk again. So I've been traveling through the U.S. and Europe for the last 3 months. I think 40 cities in the US and then 14 cities in Europe. And I've talked with a lot of people about their attitude towards Canada and how that's changed as a consequence of Trudeau. And so in the US, what I noticed in particular was that people, whether they were Democrats or Republicans, were very unhappy with Trudeau's treatment of the trucker convoy, and also shocked, I would say, that he blamed it on the Americans, especially on the Conservatives, and also appalled that he froze bank accounts. That was not a wise move. And then in Europe, I would say Canada's international reputation has taken a vicious hit. People are shocked, I would say, again, at what happened around the trucker convoy, specifically the freezing of the bank accounts. But also there's a fair bit of buzz about the new bill C-11 and the internet censorship. And so I don't think Canadians really are aware of how vicious a hit the reputation of our country has taken under our current Prime Minister. And so I thought I would talk to you about the peculiar times that we seem to find ourselves in Canada. My sense is that we get a scandal every week and have for about 6 months that under normal circumstances would be sufficient to bring down a government.
Yeah. Well, I'll pick you up on a couple of things before I go to the actual scandal point. In reference to Canada's standing either in the US or in Europe, even within the last 3 days, with the decision Roe versus Wade, Mr. Trudeau was in Rwanda, which is not near Quebec, when he commented on the operations of the Supreme Judiciary of the United States on probably the most electric issue in American politics. And here's what he had to say. I actually brought the paper with me. I'm only quoting a small bit of it. Here he is commenting on, and this is very important, he's commenting on the Supreme Court, 1/3 of the constitutional government of the United States, an equal party to Congress and the executive. And this is a prime minister in a separate country. And here's his first response to the decision. The news coming out of the United States is horrific. I pause there. He's not, never mind the particular issue. He's saying that the operation, judgment, determination, and rumination of a court, of a judiciary, of the judicature of the United States, the constitutional balance part, he's commenting on the operation of the essential element of government, and especially on the judges, and he's calling it horrific. Number two, he goes on. Now he's going to what he would call substance. My heart goes out to the millions of American women who are now set to lose their legal right to an abortion. The last phrase is patently false, but the biggest thing there is, who was he to play the Bill Clinton empathizer to the constituents of another nation? Now, if you were telling me he's earned a bad reputation in the United States because of blaming American right-wing authorities for bringing money into the convoy, which was proven false. The majority and by far of the money that went to the convoy came from ordinary donors in Canada. But every time Trudeau has a problem in Canada, he looks to the right wing of the United States as his convenient villain. Well, what do you think he's going to do now when the people in the United States and in the government, Democrats should be pissed with this as well? He's saying that the United States Supreme Court is an agency of horrific decisions and implying that they're deliberately bringing great pain to American women and stirring up anger. And I'll tap that off by pointing out one other thing. You've already had a night of rage. You've had people storming the private houses of the U.S. Supreme Court. You've had an institution burnt down. You've had the legislature, I think it was in Arizona, invaded so that the police had to. Well, you know, if it were a reverse situation, words of encouragement from an outside prime minister saying that the decision was horrific and that it's going to cause anger on an issue this hot, that was grotesquely irresponsible. And if we're going to blame people's actions on public words, which is a liberal thing to do, then part of the mayhem that we're going to see in the United States over this decision comes from encouragement from our dilettante prime minister here in Canada.
Well, I also don't understand it strategically in some real sense, because it looks self-evident that the Democrats are going to face a catastrophic electoral defeat in the fall. And that means that the Trudeau government, assuming it lasts the next 2 or 3 years that it's hypothetically likely to last, is going to be dealing with a much more conservative ally on the Southern Front. And the steps taken to alienate all those people, especially after he also blamed the MAGA-type Republicans for funding the trucker convoy to destabilize Canadian democracy, just doesn't seem like the most diplomatic or wise thing to do when you're dealing with people who are, well, crucial to us on the trading front, let's say, and not say nothing of defense.
Well, one thing you don't look for in the pronouncements of Mr. Trudeau is wisdom. That's a ridiculous effort to begin with, and it will give you no results whatsoever. What you should look for, and which he's given evidence of over the last 7 years, that what he might lack in intellectual sweep, he more than compensates by a certain instinct of cunning. And the reason for slamming Roe versus Wade is that he thinks he's found yet another issue, even though it's in another country, and even though the judicial determinations of the U.S. Supreme Court have no valence or relevance to Canadians, nonetheless, it's the kind of, it's the kind of raw meat, to use an expression he likes a lot when he applies it to the kind of raw meat you throw out. I found it even more annoying that here you are in Rwanda, on your way to a castle in Bavaria, being hit by this RCMP scandal, and you got to jump out of your chair 3 minutes after the Supreme Court decision is announced to let the world know you think their deliberation was horrific, to stir up the already angry hard leftists in the United States, and detract from any attention being paid to issues in Canada, like inflation, gasoline.
I know that Rex Murphy is so much fun, that's why we're showing it. But also, we have more things, like I'm not just showing other people's, if you want to look up Rex Murphy and have some nostalgia and actually some insight, he's a smart guy. But we're flipping into the next video. And
he said very specifically, depending on the questions you ask Putin,
check this stuff
you know, you could be arrested or not. And I said, listen to what you're saying. You're
want
saying
you
the
guys
U.S.
to
government
enjoy the
has like control over my questions and they'll arrest me if I ask the wrong question. Like, how are we better than Putin if that's true? Killing Navalny during the Munich Security Conference in the middle of a debate over $60 billion in Ukraine funding? Maybe the Russians are dumb. I didn't get that vibe at all. I don't think we kill people in other countries to affect election outcomes. Oh, wait. No, we do it a lot and have for 80 years.
The following is a conversation with Tucker Carlson, a Vladimir Putin. We discuss is they're willing to talk I do to the degree sponsors
to say, you know, as much as you can, honestly, so you don't get confused by your own lies, and just to be yourself. And I thought that he went into it like an overprepared student, and I kept thinking, why is he nervous? But you know, I guess because he thought a lot of people were going to see it.
But he was also probably prepared to give you a full lesson in history, as he did.
Well, I was totally shocked by that and very annoyed because I thought he was filibustering. I thought he would. I mean, I asked him, as I usually do, the most obvious, dumbest question ever, which is, you know, why'd you do this? And he had said in a speech that I think is worth reading. I don't speak Russian, so I haven't heard it in the original, but he had said at the moment of the beginning of the war, he had given this address to Russians in which he explained to the fullest extent we have seen so far why he was doing this. And he said in that speech, I fear that NATO, the West, the United States, the Biden administration will preemptively attack us. And I thought, well, that's interesting. I mean, I can't evaluate whether that's a fear rooted in reality or one rooted in paranoia, but I thought, well, that's an answer right there. And so I alluded to that in my question, and rather than answering it, he went off on this long, from my perspective, kind of tiresome, sort of greatest hits of Russian history, and the implication, I thought, was, well, Ukraine is ours, or Eastern Ukraine is ours already. And I thought he was doing that to avoid answering the question. So, you know, the last thing you want when you're interviewing someone is to get rolled. And I didn't want to be rolled. So I, a couple of times, interrupted him politely, I thought, but he wasn't having it. And then I thought, you know what? I'm not here to prove that I'm a great interviewer. It's kind of not about me. I want to know who this guy is. I think a Western audience, a global audience, has a right to know more about the guy. And so just let him talk. You know, because it's not, you know, I don't feel like my reputation's on the line. People have already drawn conclusions about me, I suppose, to the extent they have. I'm not interested really in those conclusions anyway. So just let him talk. And so I calmed down and just let him talk. And in retrospect, I thought that was really, really interesting. You know, whether you agree with it or not, or whether you think it's relevant to the war in Ukraine or not, that was his answer. And so it's inherently significant.
Well, you said he was nervous. Were you nervous? Were you afraid? This is Vladimir Putin.
Well, I wasn't afraid at all. And I wasn't nervous at all.
Did you drink tea beforehand?
No, I did my normal regimen of nicotine pouches and coffee. Mm-hmm. No, I'm not a tea drinker. I tried not to eat, you know, all the sweets they put in front of us, which is that is my weakness, is eating crap. But you eat a lot of sugar before, as you know, before an interview, and it does dull you. So I successfully resisted that. But I wasn't nervous. I wasn't nervous the whole time I was there. Why would I be? You know, I'm 54. My kids are grown. I believe in God. You know, I'm almost never nervous. But no, I wasn't nervous. I was just interested. I mean, I'm interested in Soviet history. I studied it in college. I've read about it my entire life. My dad, you know, worked in the Cold War. It was a constant topic of conversation. And so to be in the Kremlin in a room where Stalin made decisions, either wartime decisions or decisions about murdering his own population, I just couldn't get over it. You know, we were in Molotov's old office. So for me, I was just blown away by that. I thought I knew a lot about Russia. It turns out I knew a lot about the Soviet period, you know, the 1937 purge trials, the famine in Ukraine. Like, I knew a fair amount about that, but I really knew nothing about contemporary Russia, less than I thought I did, it turned out. And, but yeah, I was just blown away by where we were. And that's kind of one of the main drivers at this stage in my life of it, that's why I do what I do, is because I'm interested in stuff and I want to see as much as I can and try and draw conclusions from it to the extent I can. So I was very much caught up in that, but no, I wasn't nervous. I didn't think he's going to like kill me or something. And I'm not particularly afraid of that anyway. So
not afraid of dying.
Not really. No. I mean, again, it's it's an age and stage in life thing. I mean, I've 4 children, so there were times when they were little where I was terrified of dying, because if I died, it would have huge consequences. But no, I mean, at this point, I don't want to die. I'm really enjoying my life, but I've been with the same girl for 40 years, and I have 4 children who I'm extremely close to. Well, now 5, a daughter-in-law, and I love them all. I'm really close to them. I tell them I love them every day. I've had a really interesting life.
What was the goal? Just linger on that. What was the goal for the interview? Like, how were you thinking about it? What would success be like in your head leading into it?
To bring more information.
Just information.
To the public. Yeah, that's it. I mean, I have really strong feelings about what's, happening not just in Ukraine or Russia, but around the world. I think the world is resetting to the grave disadvantage of the United States. I don't think most Americans are aware of that at all. And so that's my view, and I've stated it many times because it's sincere. But my goal was to have more information brought to the West so people could make their own decisions about whether this is a good idea. I mean, I guess I reject the whole premise of the war in Ukraine from the American perspective, which is, a tiny group of dumb people in Washington has decided to do this for reasons they won't really explain. And you don't have a role in it at all as an American citizen, as the person who's paying for it, whose children might be drafted to fight it, just shut up and obey. I just reject that completely. I guess I'm a child of a different era. I'm a child of participatory democracy to some extent, where your opinion as a citizen is not irrelevant. And so I'm just, and I guess the level of lying about it was starting to drive me crazy. And I've said, and I will say again, I am not an expert on the region, or really any region other than, say, Western Maine. I just don't, I'm not Russian. And, but it was obvious to me that we were being lied to in ways that were it was crazy, the scale of the lies. And I'll just give you one example. The idea that Ukraine would inevitably win this war. Now, victory was never, as it never is, defined precisely. Nothing is ever defined precisely, which is always a tell that there's deception at the heart of the claim. But Ukraine's on the verge of winning. Well, I don't know. I mean, I'm hardly a tactician or a military expert. For the 5th time, I'm not an expert on Russia or Ukraine. I just look at Wikipedia. Russia has 100 million more people than Ukraine. 100 million. It has much deeper industrial capacity, war material capacity than all of NATO combined.
I don't need
for
to tell
example,
you guys
Russia is turning out artillery
Russia
shells,
wars
which
a
are
fraud,
significant in a ground war, at a ratio of 7 to 1.
It doesn't hurt
compared to
remind
all NATO
ourselves,
countries
though,
combined.
Like, what the
That's
hell?
all of Europe. Russia is producing 7 times the artillery shells as all of Europe combined? What? That's an amazing fact. And it turns out to be a really significant fact. In fact, the significant fact. But if you ask your average person in this country, even a fairly well-informed person of good faith who's just trying to understand what's going on, who's going to win this war? Well, Ukraine's going to win. They're on the right side. And they think that because our media, who really just do serve the interests of the U.S. government, period, they are state media in that sense, have told them that for over 2 years. And I was in Hungary last summer talking to the Prime Minister, Viktor Orban, who's whatever you think of him, is a very smart guy, like smart on a scale that we're not used to in our leaders. And I said to him off camera, so is Ukraine going to win? And he looked at me like I was deranged, or I was congenitally, deficient. Are they going to win? No, of course they can't win. It's tiny compared to Russia. Russia has a wartime economy. Ukraine doesn't really have an economy. No, look at the populations. He was looked at me like I was stupid. And I said to him, I think most Americans believe that because NBC News and CNN and all the news channels, all of them tell them that because it's framed exclusively in moral terms and it's Churchill versus Hitler. And of course, Churchill's going to prevail in the end. And it's just so dishonest that it doesn't even matter what I want to happen or what I think ought to happen. That's a distortion of what is happening. And if I have any job at all, which I sort of don't actually at this point. But if I do have a job, it's to just try to be honest. And that's a lie.
There is a more nuanced discussion about what winning might look like. You're
For
right.
sure.
A nuanced discussion is not being had, but it is possible for Ukraine to quote unquote win with the help of the United States.
I guess that conversation needs to begin by defining terms. And the key term is win. What does that mean?
Peace, a ceasefire, who owns which land.
Yes.
Coming to the table with, as you call the parent, the United States.
Yes.
Putting leverage on the negotiation to make sure there's a fairness.
Amen. Well, of course, and I should just restate this. I am not emotionally involved in this. I'm American in every sense, and my only interest is in America. I'm not leaving, ever. And so I'm looking at this purely from our perspective, what's good for us. But also as a human being, as a Christian, I mean, I hate war, and anybody who doesn't hate war shouldn't have power, in my opinion. So I agree with that definition vehemently. A victory is like not killing an entire generation of your population. It's not being completely destroyed to be eaten up by BlackRock or whatever comes next for them. So yeah, we were close to that a year and a half ago, and the Biden administration dispatched Boris Johnson, the briefly prime minister of the UK, to stop it and to say to Zelensky, who I feel sorry for, by the way, because he's caught between these forces that are bigger than he is, to say, no, you cannot come to any terms with Russia. And the result of that has not been a Ukrainian victory. It's just been more dead Ukrainians and a lot of profit for the West. It's a moral crime, in my opinion. And I tried to ask Boris Johnson about it, because why wouldn't I? After he denounced me as a tool of the Kremlin or something. And he demanded $1 million to talk to me.
Wow.
And this just happened last week. And by the way, in writing too, I'm not making this. I'm not
Just
making
for
this
the
up.
record, you demanded $1 million from me to talk to me today.
I did, and you paid. No, I'm of course kidding. But and I said to his guy, I said, I just interviewed Putin, who was widely recognized as a bad guy. And he did it for free. He didn't demand $1 million. He wasn't in this for profit. Like, are you telling me that Boris Johnson is sleazier than Vladimir Putin? And of course, that is the message. And so I guess these are really, it's not just about Boris Johnson being a sad, rapacious fraud, which he is obviously, but it's about like the future of the West and the future of Ukraine, this country that purportedly we care so much about. All these people are dying, and like, what is the end game? It's also deranged that I didn't imagine and don't imagine that I could like add anything very meaningful to the conversation, because I'm not a genius, okay? But I felt like I could, at the very least, puncture some of the lies, and that's an inherent good.
Vladimir Putin, after the interview, said that he wasn't fully satisfied because you weren't aggressive enough. You didn't ask sharp enough questions. First of all, what do you think about him saying that?
I don't even understand it. I guess it does seem like the one Putin statement that Western media take at face value. Everything else Putin says is a lie, except his criticism of me, which is true. But I mean, I have no idea what he meant by that. I can only tell you what my goal was, as I've suggested, was not to make it about me. I watched, he hasn't done any interviews of any kind for years. But the last interview he did with an English-speaking reporter, Western media reporter, was like many of the other interviews he'd done with Western media reporters. Mike Wallace's son did an interview with him that was of the same variety, and it was all about him. I'm a good person, you're a bad person. And I just feel like that's the most tiresome, fruitless kind of interview. It's not about me. I don't think I'm an especially good person. I've definitely never claimed to be. But people can make their own judgments. And again, the only judgments that I care about are my wife and children and God. So I'm just not interested in proving I'm a good person. And I just want to hear from him. And I had a lot of, you should see, I almost never write questions down, but I did in this case, because I had I had 3 years to think about it as I was trying to book the interview, which I did myself. But it was all about internal Russian politics and Navalny. And I had a lot of, I thought, really good questions. And then at the last second, and you make these decisions, as you know, since you interview people a lot, often you make them on the fly. And I thought, no, I want to talk about the things that haven't been talked about and that I think matter in a world historic sense. And the number one among those, of course, is the war. and what it means for the world. And so I stuck to that. I mean, I did ask about Gershkovich, who I felt sorry for, and I wanted Putin to release him to me, and I was offended that he didn't. I thought his rationale was absurd. Well, we want to trade him for someone. I said, well, doesn't that make him a hostage? Which of course it does. But other than that, I really wanted to keep it to the things that I think matter most. People can judge whether I did a good job or not, but that was my decision.
In the moment, what was your gut? Did you want to ask some tough questions as follow-ups on certain topics?
I don't know what it would mean to ask a tough question.
Clarifying questions, I suppose they would.
I guess. I just wanted him to talk. I just wanted to hear his perspective. Again, I've probably asked more asshole questions than like any living American. Sure. I'm, as has been noted correctly, I'm a dick by my nature. And so I just feel at this stage of my life, I didn't need to prove that I could, like, Vladimir Putin, answer the question.
Sure, for sure.
I think if I had been, 34 instead of 54, I definitely would have done that, because I would have thought this is really about me and I need to prove myself. And also, no, I just, there's a war going on that is wrecking the U.S. economy in a way and at a scale people do not understand. The U.S. dollar is going away. That was, of course, inevitable ultimately because everything dies, including currencies. But that death, that process of death, has been accelerated exponentially by the behavior of the Biden administration and the U.S. Congress, particularly the sanctions. And people don't understand what the ramifications of that are. The ramifications are poverty in the United States. Okay. So I just wanted to get to that because I'm coming at this from not a global perspective. I'm coming at it from an American perspective.
So you mentioned Navalny.
Mm-hmm.
After you left, Navalny died in prison.
Yes.
What are your thoughts on, just at a high level first, about his death?
Well, it's awful. I mean, imagine dying in prison. I've thought about it a lot. I've known a lot of people in prison, a lot, including some very good friends of mine. So I felt instantly sad about it. From a geopolitical perspective, I don't know any more than that. And I laugh at and sort of resent, but mostly find amusing, the claims by American politicians, who really are the dumbest politicians in the world, actually. This happened, and here's what it means. And it's like, actually, as a factual matter, we don't know what happened. We don't know what happened. We have no freaking idea what happened. We can say, and I did say, and I will say again, I don't think you should put opposition figures in prison. I really don't. I don't. Period. It happens a lot around the world. It happens in this country, as you know, and I'm against all of it. But do we know how he died? The short answer, no, we don't. Now, if I had to guess, I would say killing Navalny during the Munich Security Conference in the middle of a debate over $60 billion in Ukraine funding, maybe the Russians are dumb. I didn't get that vibe at all. I don't see it, but maybe they killed him. I mean, they certainly put him in prison, which I'm against. But here's what I do know is that we don't know. And so when Chuck Schumer stands up and Joe Biden reads some card in front of him with lines about Navalny, it's like, I'm allowed to laugh at that because it's absurd. You don't know.
There's a lot of interesting ideas about if he was killed, who killed him.
Yeah.
Because it could be Putin. It could be somebody in Russia who's not Putin.
Yeah.
It could be Ukrainians, because it would benefit the war.
They killed Dugin's daughter in Moscow. So, yeah, it's possible.
And it could be, the United States could also be involved.
I don't think we kill people in other countries to affect election outcomes. Oh, wait. No, we do it a lot and have for 80 years, and it's shameful. I can say that as an American because it's my money in my name. Yeah, I'm really offended by that. And I never thought that was true. And I spent, again, I'm much older than you. And so I spent my worldview was defined by the Cold War. And very much in the house I lived in Georgetown, in Washington, D.C., that's what we talked about. And and the left at the time, I don't know, the wacko MIT professor who I never had any respect for, who I know you've interviewed, et cetera. Like the hard left was always saying, well, the United States government is interfering in other elections. And I just dismissed that completely out of hand as stupid and actually a slander against my country. But it turned out to all be true, or substantially true anyway. And that's been a real shock for me in middle age to understand that. But anyway, as to Navalny, look, I don't know. But we should always proceed on the basis of what we do know, which is to say on the basis of truth, knowable truth. And if you have an entire policy-making apparatus that is making the biggest decisions on the face of the planet on the basis of things that are bullshit or lies, you're going to get bad outcomes every time. And that's why we are where we are.
Does it bother you that basically the most famous opposition figure in Russia is sitting in prison?
Well, of course it does. Of course it bothers me. I mean, it bothered me when I got there. It bothers me now. I was sad when he died. Yeah, I mean, that's one of the measures of, it's one of the basic measures of political freedom. Are you imprisoning people who oppose you? You know, are you imprisoning people who pose a physical risk to you? I mean, there's some subjective decision-making involved in these things. However, big picture, yeah. Do you have opposition leaders in jail? It's not a politically free society, and Russia isn't, obviously. And as I said, a friend of mine from childhood, an American, actually, he was a wonderful person, lives in Russia with his Moscow with his Russian wife. And I had dinner with him. He's a very balanced guy, totally non-political person. And speaks Russian and loves his many Russian children and loves the culture. And there's a lot to love. The culture that produced Tolstoy. You know, it's not a gas station with nuclear weapons, sorry. Only a moron would say that. It's a very deep culture. I don't fully understand it, of course, but I admire it. Who wouldn't? But I asked him, like, what's it like living here? And he goes, it's great. Moscow is a great city, indisputably. He said, you don't want to get involved in Russian politics. And I said, what? He said, well, you could get hurt. You could wind up like Navalny if you did. But also it's just too complicated. You know, the Russian mind is not exactly the same. It's a European city, but it's not quite European. And the way they think is very, very complex. Very complex. It's too complicated. Just don't get involved. And I would just say two things. One, I'm not sure. I mean, like, I don't know. But my strong sense is that Navalny's death, whoever did it, probably didn't have a lot to do with the coming election in Russia. My sense from talking to Putin and the people around him is they're not really focused on that. I mean, in fact, I asked one of his top advisors, when's the election? And she looked at me completely confused. She didn't know the date of the election. Okay. She's like, March? Okay. And I asked a bunch of other people just in Moscow, who's Putin running against? Like, nobody knew. So it's not a real election, right? In the sense that we would recognize at all. Second, I was really struck by so many things in Moscow and really deeply bothered by a lot of things that I saw there. But one thing I noticed was the total absence of cult of personality propaganda, which I expected to see and have seen around the world. Jordan, for example. I don't know if you've been to Jordan, but go to Jordan. In every building, there are pictures of the king and his extended family. And that's a sign of political insecurity. You know, you don't create a cult of personality unless you're personally insecure and also unless you're worried about losing your grip on power. None of that. It's interesting. And I expected to see a lot of it, you know, like statues of Putin. No, there are no statues of anybody other than like Christian saints. So that was like, I'm not quite sure. I'm just reporting what I saw. So yes, it's not in a political sense, it's not a free country. It's not a democracy, in the way that we would understand it or want. I don't want to live there. Okay. Because I like to say what I think. In fact, I make my living doing it. But it's not Stalinist in a recognizable way. And anyone who says it is should go there and tell me how.
I mean, this question about the freedom of the press is underlying the very fact of the interview you're having with him.
Right.
So you might not need to ask the Navalny question, but did you feel like, are there things I shouldn't say?
I mean, how honest do you want me to be? I mean it.
All right, gang, we're going to wrap that piece up. That's super interesting. That's Lex Friedman. Check out his podcast, his channel. He's a pretty famous Russian, super smart. Well, he's not Russian, but a Russian immigrant to the United States. And now we're going to jump into this other piece that, well, we showed it earlier, but it's so good. How can we not watch it twice? Like, we're going to watch
Ezra
it
Levant
twice.
for Rebel News. And I'd like to thank the UN for accrediting
I love these guys
a
at
citizen
Rebel
journalist
News.
outlet
Please
like us.
like, subscribe.
Mr.
find them,
Guilbeault, according to the Globe and Mail,
get
You
involved
serve
with
on the
Rebel
China
News.
Council
They're
for
fun.
International Cooperation on Environment and Development, which is a government agency controlled by the Chinese Communist Party. Is that a conflict of interest with your role as a Canadian cabinet minister? And is it perhaps why you have really been gentle on China, even though it is by far the world's largest polluter, including with plastics pollution?
Wow.
Thanks again for letting me ask that question.
The Canada-China Council is an organization that has been in existence since, from memory, 1971 or 1972, and a succession of environment ministers from all colors and stripes, including under Stephen Harper. A number of environment ministers sat on this organization. It is a partnership where we exchange information on environmental issues, and we work together to develop public policies that are implemented in China to tackle a number of the things that we're talking about here.
You lost a court case to me, and the judge ordered you to pay $20,000, but instead of paying it yourself, you had taxpayers pay for it. Why? Minister Guilbeault, the court ordered you to pay me $20,000, but you foisted that on taxpayers instead. You illegally blocked me on Twitter. You fought for 2 years. You used $250,000 in taxpayers' money, and then you stiffed the taxpayer and foisted the bill on them. Why did you do that? Why don't you think you have to answer for $20,000 of legal bills that you send to the taxpayer to pay your fine? Why aren't you talking about it? You had a lot to say in court. You claimed that your Twitter account was a personal account. If that's the case, why didn't you pay the fine personally? Do you disrespect taxpayers, Mr. Guilbeault? Sure seems that way. Hey, you're on the board of a Chinese agency, a Chinese government agency for the environment. How is that not a conflict of interest, given that you're in the Canadian cabinet? Is that why you never criticize China, the world's largest producer of plastic? Why are your staff pulling at me? Why are they assaulting me, sir? Why don't you ever criticize China? Have you received help from China in your political campaigns too?
It's fun to watch. Look how cross Guilbeault
China refuses to sign the anti-plastics treaty. Why are you forcing that on
I like
Canadians?
these guys at Rebel News a lot.
What does that mean, the registry, Mr.
Ezra
Guilbeault?
Levant.
What do you
He's
mean by
awesome.
it?
I've
What
been
is the
watching
cost
or
that
listening to his podcast
the
for
organization
months.
and taxpayer will need to pay for your registry?
Run away! Run away!
So guys, we're going to wrap it up. I'm Ehren. This is Question Period Canada. We try to put together a pretty fun, entertaining show every afternoon. Usually it's Question Period, like that's sort of the foundation. But on the days there's not Question Period, we're coming with even better stuff. That's it. We found out about how to show Rebel News a little bit, and we're going to do that. And they're a fun group to watch. I had such a blast this afternoon. A lot of new people in the room. Thank you all for checking us out. We'll be in touch. And yeah, we're just going to wrap it up. Like, it's been busy. That was a fun afternoon, I think. I hope you guys like the variety of videos, especially like the regular viewers. That let me know in the comments what you want to see different. I'm listening, and we just want to learn more about Canadian federal politics, and we'll be doing that right here every day. Ehren, Question Period Canada, have something healthy to eat today. it's getting a lot easier to stay warm, but there's only going to be more tent cities because it's easy. Like, what are you going to do? That's it. We'll catch you next video. Thank you very much for watching this one. We'll see you next time. Have a good one.